He didn't ask for mercy, he asked for his dog. The room smelled too clean, like something had been wiped away before anyone could notice it was gone, and Lucas Reed sat still in the metal chair, wrists resting lightly on his knees, eyes forward but unfocused, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear, the hum of fluorescent lights above casting a pale, sterile glow across the gray walls, the kind of light that flattened everything, drained it of warmth, of memory, of truth. And yet something lingered beneath it, something faint and wrong, like the ghost of smoke after a fire that no one admitted had happened, and Lucas breathed it in slowly, steady, controlled, the way he had learned to breathe during long nights in the field, counting seconds between each inhale, each exhale, grounding himself in rhythm while the world pressed in around him, because rhythm was something no one could take, not even here, not even now, and across the room a clock ticked quietly, its sound too loud in the silence, marking time in inches rather than seconds, each click a step closer to something final, something irreversible, but Lucas didn't look at it, didn't acknowledge it, because his focus was somewhere else entirely, somewhere with 4 paws and amber eyes and a memory sharper than any blade, and when the officer by the door cleared his throat and asked if he wanted anything before the scheduled time, Lucas shook his head once, slow, deliberate, then lifted his gaze just enough to meet the man's eyes and said, "Bring him," his voice low but steady, carrying a weight that didn't belong to fear, because fear had long since burned out of him, replaced by something quieter, something deeper, something that refused to break even now, and the officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, like he didn't quite understand, like the request didn't fit the script they were all supposed to follow, but Lucas didn't repeat himself, didn't need to, because the words hung there in the air, undeniable, immovable. And after a moment the officer nodded and stepped out, the door closing with a soft, final click that echoed longer than it should have, leaving Lucas alone. Again with the hum, the light, the faint scent that refused to settle into anything familiar, and he tilted his head just slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if testing the air, as if searching for a trace that didn't belong, because something about this place didn't sit right, not in the way it should have, not in the way truth usually did, and his fingers twitched once against his leg, a memory passing through them like electricity. The feel of coarse fur beneath his hand, the steady rise and fall of a chest that had once matched his own breathing in perfect sync, and for the first time since they brought him in, Lucas closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in recall, because out there, beyond the walls, beyond the silence, there was a dog who had never once mistaken a lie for truth, a dog who had followed him through dust and darkness and things no report ever fully captured. And if there was anything left in this world that still knew who he was, it was that dog, and somewhere down the hall, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of claws against polished concrete, slow, measured, deliberate, and Lucas's breathing shifted, just slightly, the rhythm catching for the briefest moment before settling again, because he knew that sound, he would know it anywhere, and whatever happened next, whatever truth still lingered in the air of that room, it was about to be found. The sound grows clearer with each passing second, claws tapping in a slow, deliberate rhythm that carries through the hallway like a memory refusing to fade, and every person in the room shifts without meaning to, their posture tightening, their breath held just a fraction longer, because there is something about that sound that does not belong to this place, something alive in a room designed to feel final, and Lucas lifts his head slightly, not turning, not rushing, just listening, because he knows better than anyone that a dog does not enter a room like this without reading it first, without weighing the air, the people, the truth hidden between heartbeats, and when the door finally opens, it does not creak or slam, it simply parts with a quiet mechanical ease, revealing a corridor washed in the same pale light, and at its edge stands Shadow, larger than most remember, his coat a deep sable that absorbs the light rather than reflects it, his ears upright, his body still, as if he has stepped into a place where time moves differently, and for a moment no one speaks, no one moves, because the dog does not cross the threshold, he just stands there, amber eyes scanning, not frantic, not confused, but focused in a way that feels almost deliberate, almost human, and the handler beside him gives a soft command under his breath, something routine, something practiced, but Shadow does not respond, not the way a trained dog should, instead his nose lifts slightly, drawing in the air in slow, measured pulls, cataloging every scent, every trace, every story that lingers unseen, and Lucas watches without turning his body, only his eyes shifting just enough to meet the silhouette at the door, and there is no smile, no call of his name, no desperate reaching, just a quiet recognition. That settles between them like something sacred, something that does not need to be spoken, and still Shadow does not move, because something here does not match what he knows, something disrupts the pattern he has trusted his entire life, and he takes one step forward, then stops again, head tilting ever so slightly as if recalibrating, as if comparing what he sees with what he remembers, and the room feels smaller now, tighter. The air heavier with expectation, because this is not how it is supposed to go, not for a reunion, not for a final goodbye, and one of the officers shifts his weight, glancing at another as if silently asking whether to intervene, but no one does, because there is an unspoken understanding that this moment belongs to the dog as much as it does to the man sitting in the chair, and Lucas exhales slowly, steadying himself, his voice barely above a whisper when he finally speaks. "It is okay, Shadow," not a command, not a plea, just a statement offered into the space between them, and the name lands, it settles, it resonates, and for a fraction of a second something flickers in the dog's eyes, recognition, memory, something deeper than training, but instead of running forward, instead of closing the distance, Shadow shifts his gaze away from Lucas, his posture tightening, his focus locking onto something else entirely, something unseen by the others, and the subtle change is enough to send a ripple through the room. Because a dog like Shadow does not hesitate without reason, does not redirect without purpose, and Lucas feels it before he fully understands it, that quiet pull in the air, that same wrongness he noticed before, now sharpened, now undeniable, and his eyes follow the line of Shadow's gaze, moving slowly across the room until they settle on the far corner, where a man stands just slightly apart from the others, still, composed, almost invisible in his silence, and in that moment, the rhythm of the clock seems to falter, the hum of the lights fades into the background, and everything narrows down to the space between a dog, a man, and the truth that has not yet been spoken. The man in the corner does not move, not at first, and that stillness feels deliberate, like someone who has trained himself to disappear in plain sight, to become part of the background where no one thinks to look twice, but Shadow does not share that habit, because he was never trained to ignore what does not fit, he was trained to notice it, to follow it, to hold on to it even when the world insists it is nothing. And now his body shifts, not forward toward Lucas, but sideways, slow and controlled, each step placed with intention, his nose low for a moment before lifting again, testing the air in layers, and the faintest sound escapes him, not a bark, not a growl, but something quieter, something deeper, like a question asked in a language only he understands, and Lucas feels it in his chest before he hears it, that subtle vibration of recognition, of tension, of something beginning to surface, and he does not interrupt it, does not call again, because he knows this pattern. He has seen it before in places far less forgiving than this room, places where a single hesitation could mean the difference between truth and something far worse, and the officers exchange glances now, their confidence thinning, because the script they expected is no longer unfolding the way it should, and one of them takes a small step forward as if to redirect the dog, but stops when Shadow's head snaps up, eyes sharp, focused, not aggressive but unyielding, a silent boundary drawn in a space where no one expected one to exist, and the handler murmurs again, softer this time, uncertain, as if he too senses that this moment does not belong to commands. And the man in the corner shifts his weight just slightly, a movement so small it would go unnoticed by anyone else, but Shadow catches it instantly, his ears angling forward, his posture tightening, and the room seems to narrow around that single point of attention, the distance between dog and man becoming the only thing that matters, and Lucas follows it with his eyes, slow, steady, his breathing even, but something inside him begins to align, pieces that never quite fit now pressing closer together, because there is a memory there, buried beneath reports and testimonies and words that never felt right, a memory tied not to what he saw, but to what Shadow once reacted to, long before any of this, long before the accusations, and he leans forward just a fraction, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the room when he says, "Look at him," not directed at anyone in particular, but offered into the space like a truth waiting to be acknowledged, and Shadow takes another step, then another, closing the gap not with urgency but with certainty, his gaze never leaving the man who now stands a little too still, a little too composed, and for the first time, something shifts in that man's expression, not fear exactly, but a crack in the surface, a flicker of awareness that he is no longer unseen, that something has found him that cannot be reasoned with or dismissed, and Shadow stops just a few feet away, head tilted, nostrils flaring as he draws in a deeper breath, holding it for a moment as if confirming what he already knows, and then he lowers his head slightly, not in submission, but in focus, in decision, and Lucas exhales, a quiet, steady release, because he recognizes that posture, that exact stillness before everything changes, and in the silence that follows, even the clock seems to hesitate, as if time itself is waiting for the truth to finally step forward. Shadow does not lunge, does not bark, does not break the silence in any way that would be expected, and that restraint is what unsettles the room the most, because a trained dog that has made a decision does not need noise to prove it, and the man in the corner shifts again, this time more noticeably, a subtle step backward that he tries to disguise as a change in posture, but it is too late, the movement has already been marked, catalogued, stored in the silent ledger that Shadow carries in his instincts, and the dog mirrors it with a single step forward, closing the distance by inches, not rushing, not hesitating, just advancing with the quiet certainty of something that has already reached its conclusion, and Lucas watches it unfold with a stillness that borders on disbelief, not because he doubts the dog, but because he recognizes the pattern, the exact way Shadow used to behave when something was hidden in plain sight, when the truth was buried beneath layers of control and composure, and his voice comes again, softer now, almost reverent, "You remember, do not you?" Not a question, but a confirmation, and Shadow's ears flick at the sound, not turning, not breaking focus, but acknowledging it in the smallest possible way, and the officers begin to murmur, their voices low, uncertain, as if they are trying to piece together what they are seeing without admitting that it does not fit any protocol they understand, and one of them finally steps forward, hand half raised as if to intervene, but the handler reaches out and stops him with a quiet shake of his head, because even he can see it now, the shift in the dog, the way training has given way to something deeper, something that cannot be redirected without consequence, and the man in the corner exhales slowly, his composure tightening, his jaw setting just enough to reveal that the calm he wears is no longer effortless, and his eyes flick briefly toward the door, then back to the dog, calculating, measuring, searching for a way to regain control of a moment that is slipping away from him, and Shadow lowers his head slightly, drawing in another breath, longer this time, deeper, as if reaching past the surface, past the clean air and the controlled environment, into something older, something that lingers beneath all of it, and then he stops completely, every muscle still, every line of his body aligned toward that one man, and in that stillness there is a weight that presses against the room, a quiet declaration that does not need to be spoken, and Lucas feels it settle into place inside him, the final piece of something that has been incomplete for too long, and he leans forward just enough for his voice to carry, steady, unwavering, "He was there," and the words hang in the air, simple, undeniable, and for the first time the man in the corner does not hide his reaction, his eyes narrowing just slightly, his breath catching in a way that is almost imperceptible, but not to Shadow, never to Shadow, and the dog lifts his head, gaze locking onto the man's face now, no longer following scent alone, but recognizing something deeper, something tied to memory, to a moment that had been buried but not erased, and the silence stretches, taut and unbroken, until even the faint hum of the light seems to recede, leaving only the presence of a dog who has found something that refuses to stay hidden, and a man who can no longer pretend that he has not been seen. For a moment, no one moves, not the officers, not the handler, not even the man in the corner, and it is that stillness that makes everything feel louder, the clock returning to its slow, deliberate ticking, the hum of the lights pressing down again, and Shadow remains exactly where he is, unwavering, his body no longer searching, no longer questioning, but fixed with a certainty that leaves no room for doubt, and then, without warning, he shifts his weight forward and lets out a low, controlled sound, not loud, not chaotic, but firm, a signal rather than a reaction, the kind of sound that had once stopped entire operations in their tracks, and it cuts through the room with a clarity that no one can ignore, and the man in the corner takes another step back, this time unable to hide it, his hand lifting slightly as if to steady himself, and the movement draws every eye in the room, because it does not match the calm authority he had carried until now, and Lucas sees it, the fracture widening, the control slipping just enough to expose what had been hidden beneath it, and his voice comes again, stronger now, anchored in something that has finally taken shape. "Tell them," he says, not raising his tone, not forcing it, but letting the weight of the words settle where they need to, and the man does not respond, his gaze flicking toward the others, searching for support, for dismissal, for anything that might restore the balance he has lost, but the balance is already gone, and Shadow steps closer, closing the last few feet with deliberate precision, stopping just within reach, his head lifting slightly, his eyes locked onto the man's face as if reading something beyond sight, beyond scent, something tied to a moment that refuses to stay buried. And the handler takes a cautious step forward, his voice low, uncertain, calling the dog's name, but Shadow does not break focus, does not yield, because this is no longer about obedience, it is about truth, and the officers exchange another round of glances, their earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something heavier, the realization that what they are witnessing cannot be explained away by training alone, and one of them finally speaks, his voice careful, measured, asking the man in the corner to step forward, just a simple request, but it lands with a weight that shifts the entire room, and for a second, the man hesitates, and that hesitation is enough to confirm what no one has yet said out loud, and Lucas leans forward, his hands tightening slightly against his knees, his eyes steady, unwavering, because he remembers now, not in fragments, not in doubt, but clearly, the way Shadow had reacted that night, the way he had refused to stand down, the way he had tried to lead him somewhere else, somewhere that had been dismissed, overlooked, ignored, and he exhales slowly, the truth settling into place with a quiet finality. "You missed it," he says, not accusing, not angry, just stating what is, and Shadow shifts again, not advancing this time, but holding his ground, a living line drawn between what was believed and what is now undeniable, and the room tightens around that line, every person in it caught between what they thought they knew and what is now unfolding in front of them, guided not by words, not by evidence written on paper, but by a dog who never forgot what the truth smelled like. The request for the man to step forward hangs in the air longer than it should, stretching the moment into something fragile, something that feels like it could either settle or shatter depending on what comes next, and for a brief second it seems as though he might refuse, that he might remain exactly where he is and let the silence swallow the doubt that has begun to form, but the weight of every eye in the room presses against him, and slowly, reluctantly, he takes a step forward, then another, each movement careful, controlled, as if he can still shape the outcome by the way he carries himself, but Shadow adjusts instantly, mirroring the shift with a subtle repositioning, maintaining the same distance, the same line, never breaking focus, never allowing the space between them to reset, and Lucas watches it with a quiet intensity, his mind no longer searching but assembling, connecting the fragments that had once felt incomplete, the reports that never sat right, the testimony that sounded too clean, too certain, and the memory of that night returns not as a blur, but as something sharper, something anchored in the way Shadow had behaved, the way he had circled, the way he had refused to settle on the explanation that everyone else accepted without question, and Lucas leans forward slightly, his voice calm but carrying, "Ask him where he was," and the officer nearest to the man hesitates, just for a moment, before repeating the question, his tone measured, professional, but edged now with something else, something that suggests he is no longer asking out of routine, and the man exhales slowly, his gaze shifting between the faces around him, calculating again, searching for the safest version of the truth to offer. "I was on site," he says finally, his voice steady enough, practiced enough, but it lands differently now, stripped of the certainty it once held, and Shadow responds with another low, controlled sound, not louder than before, but firmer, as if rejecting the answer outright, and the handler's grip tightens slightly on the leash, though he does not pull, does not interfere, because even he can feel it now, the unmistakable tension of something unresolved rising to the surface. And Lucas shakes his head once, slow, deliberate, "Not where you said," he murmurs. More to himself than anyone else, but the words carry, settling into the cracks that have already begun to form, and the officer presses again, this time more directly, asking for specifics, for details that had once been accepted without question, and the man's composure falters, just enough to reveal the strain beneath it, his answers coming a fraction too slow, his gaze shifting a fraction too often, and Shadow steps closer still, closing the gap to just a few inches, his presence undeniable. Now, his focus unwavering, and then he does something small, something almost insignificant to anyone who does not know him. He lowers his head and pauses, holding there for a single breath, as if marking a point, as if anchoring a memory to a place that cannot be denied, and Lucas sees it, recognizes it instantly, because that was how Shadow signaled certainty, not with force, not with chaos, but with stillness, with precision. And his voice comes again, quiet but absolute, "He is telling you." And the room shifts around those words, the officers no longer looking at Lucas as the condemned, but as something else entirely, something they may have misjudged, and the man in front of Shadow swallows, the sound barely audible, but in the silence it carries, and for the first time, the control he has held begins to slip in a way that cannot be hidden, because there is no argument against what stands before him, no explanation that can override a memory carried in scent and instinct, and the truth, once distant and uncertain, now stands close enough to be touched, held in the quiet certainty of a dog who never learned how to ignore it. The air in the room shifts in a way that no one can quite explain, as if something unseen has finally crossed a line that cannot be stepped back over, and the officer closest to the man straightens, his tone no longer tentative when he speaks again, asking for clarification, for a timeline, for anything that can anchor the unraveling moment to something concrete, but the answers do not come as easily now, they arrive slower, thinner, each word carrying less weight than the one before. And Shadow does not move away, does not break his stance, he remains exactly where he is, head low, eyes fixed, holding the truth in place with nothing but presence, and Lucas feels it settle deeper inside him, the quiet certainty that had been missing for so long now solid, now undeniable, and he leans forward slightly, his voice calm, almost steady enough to sound detached, "Tell them about the fire," and the words land with precision, cutting through the confusion without force. And the man's eyes flick toward him, sharp, defensive, but only for a moment before that composure cracks again, because it is not the accusation that unsettles him, it is the way it is delivered, without anger, without desperation, as if it is simply a fact waiting to be acknowledged, and the officers exchange another look, one of them stepping closer now, his posture shifting from observer to something more active, something more engaged, and he repeats the question, this time with intention, asking about the location, the timing, the report that had been filed. And the man hesitates again, longer this time, his breath catching in a way that no longer goes unnoticed, and Shadow lifts his head slightly, his ears angling forward, his focus sharpening even further, as if the hesitation itself carries a scent, a signal, something worth marking, and Lucas watches it all unfold with a stillness that feels almost out of place, because he is no longer waiting, no longer hoping, he is witnessing. And that difference changes everything, and when the man finally speaks, his voice is not as steady as before, not as certain, the details shifting just enough to create space for doubt, and that is all it takes, because once doubt enters a room like this, it does not leave quietly, it spreads, it presses, it demands more, and the officer steps in closer, his questions sharper now, more direct, and the man's answers falter under the weight of them, each one pulling at the thread that has begun to unravel, and Shadow takes a single step forward, closing the last inch of distance, his presence now impossible to ignore, and he exhales slowly, a soft breath that carries a quiet finality, as if marking the end of uncertainty, and Lucas nods once, almost imperceptibly, because he recognizes that signal, that moment when the search ends and the truth stands alone, and the room feels different now, no longer a place of conclusion, but of interruption, of something halted just before it could become irreversible, and the officer nearest the door turns, his voice firm as he calls for a hold, for time, for space to reassess what has just surfaced, and the clock continues to tick, but its meaning has changed, no longer counting down to an ending, but stretching out into something uncertain, something open, and Lucas exhales, the first breath that does not carry the weight of finality, his eyes still on Shadow, who finally shifts his gaze, just slightly, not away, but back toward him, and in that small movement there is recognition, not just of presence, but of purpose fulfilled, as if the dog has done what he came to do, and the truth, once hidden beneath layers of certainty, now stands exposed in the quiet space between them. The command to halt echoes beyond the room, carried through radios and quiet urgency, and everything that once felt inevitable now feels suspended, as if time itself has stepped back to reconsider what it almost allowed to happen, and the officers shift positions with a purpose that did not exist minutes ago, their attention no longer fixed on Lucas but redirected, recalibrated, drawn toward the man who now stands at the center of a truth he can no longer outrun, and he does not speak at first. Not because he has nothing to say, but because every word now feels heavier, every answer measured against the weight of what has already been revealed without a single accusation needing to be forced, and Shadow remains. Close, not pressing, not escalating, just present, the quiet anchor of something undeniable, and Lucas watches as the room transforms around him, the same walls, the same light, but no longer closing in, no longer final, and for the first time since he was brought here, his shoulders ease, not in relief, not yet, but in recognition that the end he had prepared for is no longer the only path ahead, and one of the officers steps forward, his voice firm, requesting the man to step aside, to cooperate, to provide clarification under proper review, and there is no resistance this time, only a slow, reluctant compliance that speaks louder than denial ever could, and as he moves, the space he leaves behind feels different, like something has been lifted, something unseen but deeply felt, and Shadow finally breaks his fixed stance, stepping back just enough to allow the shift, his job done not through force, but through certainty. And Lucas exhales, a quiet release that carries years of unspoken weight, his gaze lowering for a moment before lifting again, finding Shadow now not as a signal, not as a detector, but as what he has always been, and the distance between them, once filled with tension and doubt, begins to close in a way that feels almost sacred, and he speaks again, softer this time, "You came back," and the words are simple, but they hold everything, the memory of nights spent side by side, the trust built in silence, the understanding that never needed explanation, and Shadow steps forward without hesitation now, crossing the final space that had held him back, his head lifting as he reaches Lucas, not rushing, not overwhelming, just arriving, and for a moment, nothing else exists in the room, not the officers, not the questions, not the uncertainty that still lingers beyond the walls, only the quiet reunion of two beings who never stopped recognizing each other. And Lucas lowers his hand slowly, giving the dog the choice, the space, the respect that had always defined their bond, and Shadow leans in, just enough, resting the weight of his presence against Lucas's hand, a small gesture, but one that carries the full weight of truth, of loyalty, of something that endured even when everything else fell apart, and around them, the room continues to move, decisions being made, procedures shifting, but in that small, still center, there is something else entirely, something untouched by confusion or doubt, something steady, and for the first time, Lucas allows himself to believe that what was almost taken from him has not been lost, that the truth did not disappear. It simply waited for the one soul that could still find it, and in the quiet that follows, the ticking clock no longer counts down, it simply marks the moment where everything changed. The room does not return to what it was, it cannot, because something fundamental has shifted, something that cannot be unseen or unheard, and the quiet that settles now is no longer heavy with finality but filled with a strange, fragile grace, the kind that comes only when something broken begins, slowly, to mend, and Lucas remains seated for a moment longer, his hand still resting against Shadow's head, fingers moving gently through the familiar texture of his fur, grounding himself in something real, something that never changed even when everything else did, and around them the officers move with new purpose, voices low but urgent, decisions unfolding beyond the edges of the moment, but none of it pulls Lucas away from what matters most, not yet, because for him, this is the moment that was almost lost, the moment that nearly slipped into silence forever, and he breathes it in fully. The faint scent of antiseptic now mixed with something warmer, something alive, something that reminds him of open air and long nights and the quiet understanding that had always existed between them, and Shadow stays close, not restless, not alert in the way he was before, but calm, steady, as if the task that brought him here has been completed, and what remains now is something simpler, something deeper, and Lucas lowers his forehead slightly, just enough to rest it briefly against the dog's. A gesture small and unspoken, but filled with everything he cannot put into words, and for a second, the world narrows again, not in tension, but in peace, and the handler watches from a distance, his expression softened, understanding that what he is witnessing is not just a procedure interrupted, but a bond that has endured beyond doubt, beyond accusation, beyond the edge of something irreversible, and when Lucas finally lifts his head, his eyes are different, not lighter exactly, but clearer, as if the weight that once clouded them has been shifted, replaced by something steadier. Something that no longer needs to prove itself, and one of the officers approaches, his voice respectful now. No longer distant, no longer detached, informing Lucas that everything is being reviewed, that nothing further will proceed until the truth is fully understood, and Lucas nods once, not in relief, not in celebration, but in quiet acceptance, because he knows this is not an ending, it is a beginning, a path that will take time, patience, and the same quiet strength that carried him here, and Shadow steps slightly closer, his presence unwavering, a constant in a world that has just proven how easily it can lose its way, and as the door opens again, not as a barrier but as a passage, the light beyond it feels different, not brighter, but honest, and Lucas rises slowly, his movement steady, his hand brushing once more along Shadow's neck, and for the first time, there is no hesitation in the dog's response, no pause, no distance, only a quiet step forward in perfect alignment. And together they move toward whatever comes next, not as a man saved at the last moment, and not as a dog who performed a task, but as two souls who held on to the same truth when everything else let go, and in the silence that follows, one thought remains, soft but certain, carried not in words but in the space they leave behind, that sometimes the truth does not need a voice, it only needs someone who refuses to forget its scent.